The morning started like any other quiet, crisp air drifting over my pasture, the sound of goats grazing in the distance. But then the ground shook with the rumble of 10 full-size charter buses grinding to a halt at my gate. Doors hissed open, and suddenly it was chaos, hundreds of strangers spilling onto my property as if it were some kind of amusement park. They came with coolers, lawn chairs, speakers, even volleyball nets, shouting excitedly under a massive banner that read HOA Mega Summer Festival. And at the center of it all, perched in a hot pink blazer with her trusty clipboard and a megaphone, stood Karen, the HOA president, who had been trying for months to drag my land under her rules. She had told these people this was her community space. What she didn't know was that my steel gate wasn't just decoration, it was rigged to lock with one press of a button. That morning she hadn't just brought her followers into my field, she had marched them straight into a trap. Before we dive in, drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see where everyone's tuning in from. The first thing that hit me that morning wasn't the sunlight cutting through my blinds or the familiar sound of goats bleating from the pasture. It was the deep, thunderous rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath my porch. I set down my coffee cup and leaned forward, squinting past the mist rising from the field. That's when I saw it, not one, not two, but a full caravan of 10 charter buses crawling up the gravel drive like an invading army. Their diesel engines coughed out black exhaust that floated into the cool morning air, smearing across the horizon. At first I thought maybe I was dreaming, or maybe some tourist company had taken a wrong turn off Route 21. But then the buses screeched to a stop right at the mouth of my driveway, the drivers throwing open their doors in perfect mechanical unison. What poured out next almost made me drop my coffee altogether. Wave after wave of people came streaming down the metal steps. Families lugging coolers, kids clutching inflatable toys, teenagers dragging portable speakers, retirees with folding chairs. Some even had grills strapped to rolling carts, the kind you'd expect at a tailgate, and above their heads fluttered a massive vinyl banner that read in bold letters, HOA Mega Summer Festival, thanks to our generous host. My jaw clenched. I hadn't agreed to host anything except my goats and a few barn cats. My land had never been part of the HOA, not yesterday, not last year, not ever. And yet here they were, hundreds of uninvited guests, spilling out across my pasture like it was some county fairground. I didn't need 3 guesses to know who was behind this circus. At the very front of the lead bus, standing tall in a hot pink blazer that could have blinded a pilot, was Karen. She clutched her clipboard in one hand like it was a royal scepter and gripped a megaphone in the other. Even from my porch, I could hear her voice cutting through the air like a chainsaw. Welcome, everyone. Today we reclaim community space from selfishness. This is our green belt, and no one can keep us from enjoying it. Selfishness. That word stabbed at me. She wasn't just trespassing. She was staging a morality play, and I was the villain of her script. For months, Karen had been on a crusade to absorb my land into her HOA kingdom across the road. She had sent me letters claiming my barn was the wrong color, despite it being none of her jurisdiction. She had cited fake ordinances about my goats. She even once accused me of unauthorized vehicle storage because my truck was parked near the fence line. Every attempt was designed to pressure me into submission, to force me to voluntarily join her association so she could pad her empire with more dues. But I hadn't budged. Instead, I had prepared. 2 weeks earlier, I'd noticed flyers in the neighborhood mailbox cluster. They advertised this very festival, complete with a cheerful map that highlighted my property as if it were already a public park. That's when I knew Karen wasn't bluffing anymore. She was planning a full-scale land grab, complete with propaganda. So I'd reinforced my steel gate, installed a new electronic lock that synced directly to my phone, and rerouted my security cameras for full coverage of the drive. I wasn't just ready, I was waiting. Now standing barefoot on the porch, with my coffee cooling in my hand, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Karen thought she was staging a show of power. What she didn't realize was that she had just walked 10 buses worth of witnesses into her own undoing. I slipped on my boots and stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching underfoot. The closer I got, the clearer the scene became. My once quiet pasture had been transformed into a chaotic carnival. Folding tables popped open like jack-in-the-boxes. Grill lids clanged. Teenagers strung up bunting between my oak trees, as if rehearsing for a commercial. A few kids ran screaming after one of my goats who bleated in protest before darting away. Karen stood tall, beaming like a conquering general. She raised her megaphone and shouted, "This is a community victory. Thank you to our generous host." She paused and gestured toward my house as though I'd agreed to any of this. Laughter and claps erupted from the crowd, though some applause was hesitant, like not everyone bought into her narrative. I glanced down at my phone. 8:59 a.m. 1 minute until showtime. My thumb hovered over the lock button. I passed by clusters of families setting up picnic blankets. Some gave me cheerful waves, clearly oblivious to the reality of what was happening. Others avoided my eyes, maybe already sensing the truth. That was when I spotted him, a familiar face in the crowd. It was Tom Caldwell, a zoning clerk from the county office. Months ago, he had warned me off record that Karen was obsessed with my land and was pushing creative interpretations of buffer zone law. Now he sat on a folding chair, looking deeply uncomfortable. As I walked past, he leaned closer and muttered under his breath, "This isn't public land." She lied. I gave him the smallest nod and kept walking. At exactly 9:00, I tapped my screen. The sound was subtle but powerful, a low metallic thunk that echoed across the drive as the gate's motors engaged. The steel arms swung inward with a heavy groan clanging shut behind the last bus. The red keypad light blinked, sealing with finality. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Parents glanced at the gate. Kids stopped mid-laugh. Even the bus drivers shifted nervously. The buses, all 10 of them, now sat like hulking barricades inside the entrance, cutting off any quick escape. Karen turned, expecting applause for her grand entrance, but froze when she saw the locked gate. Her megaphone squealed in feedback. "What's going on?" she barked, her voice pitched higher, trembling at the edges. I leaned against a fence post, lifted my coffee cup, and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "You're on private property. 10 buses worth of uninvited guests. That's trespassing." My words landed like stones dropped into water, sending ripples of unease through the crowd. People started murmuring, looking at each other. Some shifted their weight already, regretting stepping off those buses. Karen raised her megaphone, desperation creeping into her tone. "Don't listen to him. This is our land now. We have rights." But her eyes betrayed her. Panic flickered beneath her bravado. One of the bus drivers, a burly man with sweat darkening his cap, shuffled toward me. He lowered his voice. "Ma'am told us it was a public event. We were just hired to bring them here." I didn't smile. "Then you better park those buses tight, because nobody's leaving until the sheriff sorts this out." He nodded nervously and backed away, muttering. Behind him, a wave of restlessness passed through the crowd. Parents tugged their children closer. Some guests started folding up chairs almost as soon as they had set them down. A teenager lifted his phone and shouted, "This is going viral, dude," as he filmed Karen's bewildered expression. And me, I took another slow sip of coffee. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was sharper than anger. It was the satisfaction of a chess player watching his opponent stumble into the opening move of a trap. 10 buses. Hundreds of witnesses. Cameras rolling. Every second that gate stayed locked was another nail in Karen's coffin. And the best part, I didn't have to do a thing but stand there. This was my land. My rules. And the show had only just begun. The silence that followed the metallic clang of the gate was almost more deafening than the roar of the diesel engines that had brought those buses here. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The crowd looked around, blinking in confusion, still half believing Karen's promise that this was some new community park graciously provided by her leadership. But the blinking red light on the keypad and the locked steel arms of my gate told a different story. Then, as if on cue, the noise began again. Kids whining that they were thirsty. Parents shouting at each other about who packed the water. Teenagers cranking up their portable speakers to drown out the growing tension. A couple of older men pulled folding chairs from the luggage compartments of the buses and plopped down in the grass as though nothing unusual was happening. And above it all, Karen's voice cut through like a circular saw. "Everyone, don't panic. This is OUR land. We will not be intimidated by one selfish holdout who refuses to support the community." Her words rang hollow, but her tone was commanding. She strutted forward in her bright pink blazer, clipboard in hand, megaphone raised like a weapon. Her lipstick was so red it could have been seen from the next county over, and her hair was shellacked into a helmet that defied the breeze. I just leaned on the fence post, sipping my coffee, watching her like a zoologist observing a particularly aggressive peacock. "You see," Karen bellowed, "he locked the gate to try and stop us. But this only proves how much he fears community power. Today we reclaim what should have been ours all along." The crowd gave a scattered round of applause, though it was less enthusiastic than before. Some people clapped slowly, almost sheepishly, while others didn't bother at all. A man with a sun hat leaned toward his wife and muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Did she even have permission for this?" The wife shushed him, glancing nervously toward Karen. I caught sight of the zoning clerk again, sitting in his chair with his arms crossed. He was shaking his head. His lips moved in a whisper I could read even from several yards away. "She's finished." But Karen wasn't done. She strutted toward me, her heels sinking into the gravel. Her eyes locked onto mine like a hawk sizing up prey. "Open this gate right now," she hissed into the megaphone, though her voice carried enough to reach the first few rows of lawn chairs. "You are making a mistake you will regret." I let a slow smile spread across my face, not of humor, but of certainty. "Karen, you brought 10 buses filled with people onto private property without permission. If anyone's making a mistake, it's you." Gasps rippled through the nearest cluster of families. A boy of about 12 turned to his mother. "Mom, is he serious?" The mother's lips tightened into a line. Karen faltered for half a second, then snapped back with her trademark venom. "This isn't private, this is community land. Everyone here is a witness." I raised my phone, showing the glowing screen with my security app open. "Everyone here is a witness, all right. A witness to trespassing." With one tap, I switched camera feeds, showing multiple angles of the crowd, the buses, even Karen herself projected onto the screen. "Smile, Karen. You're on candid camera." That made the murmurs louder. Some people began backing away from Karen, realizing this wasn't the feel-good picnic they'd been promised. Then came the sound I'd been expecting, the high-pitched buzz of drones lifting into the air. I had programmed them to activate if motion sensors detected tampering near the barn or the far fence. 4 sleek black drones hovered above the crowd, their lenses blinking like unblinking eyes. Children pointed. Teenagers cheered, whipping out their phones to capture the sci-fi showdown. One of the bus drivers muttered something about hazard pay and lit a cigarette. Karen's face flushed crimson beneath her makeup. She swung her clipboard like a shield, as though she could swat away the reality closing in on her. "This is harassment," she screeched. "You can't imprison us here," I tilted my head. "You imprisoned yourself when you brought trespassers onto private land." I simply closed my gate. That line landed harder than I expected. People actually laughed, sharp, bitter laughs, the kind you hear when an audience realizes the show isn't going the way the director intended. Karen's grip on her megaphone tightened. Her eyes darted across the crowd, searching for support. She found less and less. Meanwhile, the sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered above the buses. Sweat beaded on foreheads. Kids whined louder. And Karen's grand spectacle began to rot from the inside out. A middle-aged man with a beer belly stomped forward, jabbing a finger at Karen. "You told us this was the new HOA park. You said we could bring our families here." Karen plastered on her politician's smile. "And you can. It is our park. He's just being—" The man cut her off. "There's a giant sign at the gate that says, 'Private property.'" "You lied." That was when the first real cracks began to spread. Others joined in, voices rising. "Yeah, Karen, you said this was approved. My kid's dehydrated. We paid for catering." "Where is it?" Karen shouted back, but her words were drowned out by the chaos. The 10 buses idled like restless beasts, engines rumbling, exhaust clouding the air. I stood calmly, letting the spectacle play out. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to posture. The truth was burning through her lies faster than any fire I could have lit myself. And then came the sound that sealed the moment, the distant wail of sirens. Sheriff's vehicles still several miles away, but close enough for the crowd to recognize. Heads turned toward the road. Relief spread across some faces, panic across others. Karen tried to rally one last time, thrusting her clipboard into the air. "Don't be afraid, we're within our rights." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. They were already turning against her. One teenager climbed onto the hood of a bus and shouted into his phone camera, "Day 1 of the HOA hostage crisis. #BusKaren. This is insane." His friends laughed and whooped, posting live updates for thousands to see. Karen's megaphone screeched again as she tried to shout over them, but her voice cracked. Her aura of authority was crumbling. And me, I just leaned back against the post, sipping my now lukewarm coffee, savoring the moment. This wasn't just a battle over land anymore. This was theater. And Karen had cast herself in the role of villain, live-streamed for the whole county, and soon the whole internet to see. By the time the sheriff arrived, there would be no doubt left. The truth was already marching across the field like an army of shadows, and Karen's pink blazer couldn't block it. I knew then that my trap had sprung perfectly. 10 buses, 500 witnesses, dozens of cameras, and Karen's empire about to collapse under its own weight. By the time the sheriff's sirens drifted closer, the pasture had become a boiling pot of chaos. The sun was high, now burning down with merciless heat, and the cracks in Karen's fantasy of a community celebration were splitting wide open. My once quiet land was littered with folding chairs, half-unpacked picnic baskets, and children sprawled in the grass, their faces sticky with sweat and boredom. The sheer scale of it all was absurd. 10 buses worth of people scattered across my property like refugees from a failed carnival. Some tried to make the best of it, setting up board games or blasting music. Others stood near the locked gate, staring at the blinking red light on the keypad as if they could will it to turn green. A small group gathered near the bus drivers demanding answers. The drivers themselves looked more and more uneasy. I watched as one leaned against the side of his bus cigarette dangling from his lips. He shook his head slowly, muttering something about never again to the driver next to him. Another was pacing, cell phone pressed to his ear, probably explaining to the company why he and 9 colleagues had unknowingly ferried a mob into private property. And then came the live streams. Everywhere I looked, phones were held high. Teenagers balanced on coolers narrating the fiasco like amateur reporters. One girl with neon green hair shouted, "Day, one of HOA meltdown live from the prison pasture," and spun around to capture Karen gesticulating wildly in the background. Her stream drew cheers from her friends, and I had no doubt those clips were already racking up views online. I could almost hear the hashtags forming number bus Karen, number pasture prison, number HOA hell. Karen, of course, was trying to wrestle the narrative back under her control. She stomped to the center of the crowd, clipboard raised like a holy relic. "Don't listen to him," she barked through her megaphone voice, cracking with strain. "This land was promised to the community. We are exercising our rights as taxpayers." Her words might have carried weight in a quiet boardroom, but here, in the sweltering heat, surrounded by sweating families who were beginning to regret coming, they landed like stones dropped into a puddle. Ripples of murmurs spread, not applause. A woman near the buses yelled, "Promised by who?" You another added, "You said there'd be shade, food, and bounce houses for the kids. Where is it, Karen?" The irony made me chuckle under my breath. For all her grandstanding, she hadn't even bothered to provide the basics. She had assumed my land would do the heavy lifting of impressing her followers. Now, with the heat climbing and tempers fraying, the crowd was turning restless. A few men dragged a heavy picnic bench across the grass, positioning it near the gate. I narrowed my eyes, already guessing what they intended. Sure enough, they hoisted it up and rammed it against the steel bars. The clang echoed like a gunshot. The gate didn't budge, not even a shiver. My contractor had built it to withstand livestock, weather, and desperate trespassers alike. The men grunted and shoved again, the wood splintering against the unyielding steel. After the third failed attempt, one of the bus drivers marched over, waving his arms. "Cut it out," he snapped. "That's criminal mischief on top of trespassing. You want to get arrested too." His words carried more authority than Karen's megaphone. The makeshift battering ram dropped with a thud, and the men slunk back, muttering curses. I stayed where I was, calm, letting the moment speak for itself. Every failed attempt at rebellion only underscored one thing: they were trapped not by me, but by Karen's lies. Meanwhile, the live streamers had a field day. "Epic fail," one boy narrated into his phone, zooming in on the broken bench. "Karen's army tries, jailbreak gate wins." Stay tuned for more HOA madness. The chat bubbles popping up on his screen flashed words like "LOL," "Karen strikes again," and "This is better than Netflix." I let myself smile. Sometimes the internet was cruel, but sometimes it was a mirror showing the truth faster than any courtroom could. Karen's face, however, was a mask of fury. Her cheeks flushed, sweat dripping from her carefully sculpted hairline. She stormed toward the group of parents gathered near the buses. "Don't believe him," she shouted, her voice wobbling. "This land is for everyone. We are victims here." But the parents weren't buying it anymore. One mother clutched a crying toddler and snapped, "Victims, you tricked us into trespassing. My kids overheated because of you." Another man waved the glossy flyer Karen had distributed. "You drew his land on this map and called it a community greenbelt. You lied, Karen." He jabbed the paper in her face, and for a moment I thought she might actually hit him with the clipboard. Instead, she spun on her heel and shouted at me, "This is illegal. You can't keep us here against our will." I raised my phone, letting the security app's screen glow for all to see. "Already called the sheriff. He'll sort this out." That sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Suddenly people weren't angry at me, they were angry at Karen. Nervous glances darted her way. Children tugged on sleeves, whispering that they wanted to go home. Even the zoning clerk finally stood, raising his voice above the din. She knew this was private property, I told her myself. Don't drag the rest of us into her obsession. The words carried weight. He was, after all, a county official, and just like that, the tide shifted further. The crowd began to split into factions. One group clustered around Karen, still loyal or too embarrassed to admit they'd been fooled. Another gathered near the buses, demanding the drivers take them home. A third simply sat in the grass, muttering into their phones, too exhausted to care. From my vantage point by the fence, I studied it all like a chessboard. Each faction was another fracture in Karen's control. Each murmur, Each angry accusation was a pawn slipping out of her grasp. Meanwhile, my goats, blissfully unaware of the drama, had retreated to the far edge of the field. Their bells tinkled faintly in the breeze, a soundtrack of calm absurdity against the human storm. I checked my watch. The sheriff couldn't be more than 10 minutes away now. Karen must have sensed it too, because her voice grew shriller, her movements more erratic. She paced the grass, barking orders into her phone, waving her arms at her dwindling supporters. Her pink blazer, once a symbol of control, was now blotched with sweat. Her carefully styled hair frizzed in the humidity. She looked less like a queen and more like a desperate performer trying to keep a failing show alive. And through it all, the cameras never stopped rolling. I realized then that I didn't need to say much. Silence was my sharpest weapon. Every second I stood calm, every sip of coffee I took while Karen flailed was another nail in the coffin of her credibility. When the sheriff finally arrived, blue and red lights flashing down the road, the crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in panic. Karen bolted toward the gate, clipboard flapping, shouting, "Officer, arrest him, he's holding us hostage." But I stayed where I was, leaning against the post, watching the pieces fall exactly where I'd expected. This was no longer just about land. It was about truth colliding with lies in front of hundreds of witnesses, and now in front of the law. And as the sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop, dust swirling around its tires, I knew one thing for certain: Karen had trapped herself far more thoroughly than I ever could. The sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop just outside the gate, its lights casting red and blue ripples across the steel bars. Dust swirled around its tires, drifting over the field like smoke on a battlefield. For a brief second, everything fell into a strange hush. The crowd stopped shouting. Children stopped crying. Even the buses, though still idling, seemed to fade into the background hum. All eyes turned to the tall figure stepping out of the county cruiser. Sheriff Dale Patterson was a man whose presence could drain the arrogance out of anyone, even a woman like Karen. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the chaos of my pasture back at her, giving her no place to hide. He didn't rush, didn't bark orders. He just walked slowly toward the gate, taking in the sight of 10 buses, hundreds of restless people, scattered picnic debris, and one very sweaty HOA president in a pink blazer, clutching a clipboard like it was a life raft. Karen reacted the way she always did, with volume. "Officer," she screeched into her megaphone, her voice cracking. "Arrest him immediately. He's holding us hostage on this property. We came here for a peaceful community event, and he locked us in against our will." The crowd murmured, half expecting the sheriff to nod and stride toward me. But instead, Sheriff Patterson adjusted his sunglasses, looked slowly around, and asked a single question that sliced through the heat and tension like a knife. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority, "why are you and all these people on his land?" The pause that followed was almost delicious. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. Her hand tightened on the clipboard. She gestured vaguely toward the field, her voice faltering. This is community land. It belongs to everyone. We're exercising our rights." The sheriff raised one eyebrow. "Show me the deed," he said, simply holding out his hand. Karen blinked, stammered, flipped through her clipboard as if she could conjure up property ownership from a list of HOA meeting notes. The sweat on her forehead glistened under the midday sunday. When it became clear she had nothing, the sheriff turned to me. "You got paperwork." I stepped forward, calm as ever, and handed him the folder I had been carrying since the moment the buses rolled in. Inside was everything: title, deed, survey, maps, tax records, even letters from the zoning office confirming my property had never and would never fall under HOA jurisdiction. He flipped through it, nodding slowly. "That'll do," he said, handing it back. The murmurs of the crowd swelled into open disbelief. A man shouted, "You lied to us, Karen." Another woman waved the glossy flyer in the air. "She told us this was the new HOA park." The sheriff looked back at Karen, his tone growing sharper. "You brought 10 buses of people onto private land without permission. That's trespassing. And if you collected money for this event, that's fraud." Karen's face drained of color beneath the layers of foundation and blush. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her supporters, what few remained, were already drifting away, their loyalty collapsing under the weight of reality. Behind her, the zoning clerk, Tom Caldwell, finally stepped forward. He raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I told her this was private property. She ignored me. She planned this, knowing full well she didn't have permission. That was the killing blow." The crowd gasped, like an audience at the climax of a courtroom drama. Parents began shouting at Karen, demanding refunds for tickets or fees they'd paid. Teenagers whooped, turning their phones toward her to capture every twitch of panic. Karen clutched her clipboard to her chest, backing toward the gate like a cornered animal. "This is a misunderstanding," she wailed. "We were trying to build community spirit. The sheriff wasn't buying it." He motioned to his deputies who had just arrived in a second cruiser. "We're going to get these people out of here one bus at a time. Nobody touches the gate without my say-so." I nodded. "It stays locked until you're ready." He gave me a quick, almost imperceptible smile, a silent acknowledgement that I had played this exactly right. The deputies moved through the crowd, their calm but firm voices, directing people back to the buses. Slowly, reluctantly, the makeshift festival began to disassemble. Lawn chairs folded, coolers slammed shut. Children were hauled back up the bus steps whining about their unfinished games. All the while the news crews filmed every second. Their cameras poked through the bars, lenses glinting in the sunlight, capturing Karen's humiliation in high definition. One reporter shouted, "Did you lie to your HOA members, Karen? Did you misuse funds for this event?" Karen tried to answer, but her voice was drowned out by the engines of 10 buses roaring back to life. The sound was like an army retreating one diesel beast at a time. Before the sheriff gave the order to open the gate, I walked forward just far enough to be seen and heard. "This is my land," I said, my voice carrying across the field. "It always has been, and anyone who tries to take it will find the gate closed." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, some embarrassed, some angry, but all realizing they had been duped. Karen, trembling, tried to lunge forward. "You humiliated me." She spat, her voice ragged. "This isn't over." I met her eyes calm as stone. "No, Karen. You humiliated yourself. I just locked the gate." That line hung in the air, repeated in whispers, captured on cameras, destined to become a meme before the sun went down. The sheriff gave the signal, and the gate creaked open with a metallic sigh. One by one, the buses lumbered out their passengers, glaring at Karen, some shouting insults out the windows as they passed. Each engine's roar was like a nail hammered into the coffin of her reputation. By the time the last bus pulled away, only Karen remained inside the gate, her clipboard hanging limp in her hand, her blazer stained with sweat and dust. She looked less like a leader and more like a ghost of authority, stripped bare in front of everyone she had tried to impress. The sheriff gestured toward the road. "Time to go, ma'am." She hesitated, glaring at me one last time. "You'll regret this," she hissed, though her voice lacked the venom it once carried. Maybe I said evenly, but at least I'll regret it on my own land. The deputy guided her out, his hand hovering near his holster, in case she decided to stage one last dramatic stunt. But she didn't. She just shuffled toward a waiting SUV, her pink blazer shrinking into the distance. The gate closed again with a solid clang, sealing my property back into silence. For the first time that day, I exhaled deeply. The pasture was littered with trash, yes, napkins, paper cups, broken bunting, but it was mine again. My goats, sensing the calm, wandered back toward the barn, their bells tinkling like a victory anthem. On the porch, I set my coffee cup down now, cold, and replayed the sheriff's simple question in my head: "Why are you and all these people on his land?" It was the kind of line that turned the tide of a battle. Karen thought she had staged a triumph. Instead, she had handed me the perfect stage to expose her lies, in front of 500 witnesses, 2 news crews, and the law itself. And though the buses were gone, I knew this wasn't the final act. Karen was many things, but a quitter wasn't one of them. She would come back with lawyers, petitions, smear campaigns. She would double down as she always did. But that was fine. Because today had proved something even stronger than my gate, the truth once locked in the open couldn't be ignored. The battle was far from over, but I had just won the most public victory of all. The silence that settled over my property after those 10 buses rumbled out was almost eerie. For hours, the land had been alive with shouting, laughter, and arguments. Now there was nothing but the faint creak of the gate closing and the soft tinkling of goat bells as my herd wandered back toward the barn. I stood there in the gravel boots planted firm, staring at the dust trails left behind on the road. It was over, or at least the spectacle part was. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. Karen was the kind of person who never admitted defeat. She didn't know how. Losing in public was like oxygen being ripped from her lungs. And today, she hadn't just lost. She'd been dismantled in front of hundreds of her own people, the sheriff and the local press. For someone like her, humiliation only fueled obsession. I barely made it inside before my phone buzzed with a flood of notifications. Clips from the fiasco had already gone viral. Titles blared across my screen: "Bus Karen, Meltdown, HOA, Trapped on Private Ranch, This Man Outsmarted HOA Tyrant." Memes were everywhere, Karen's face red with rage, plastered on movie posters, and GIF loops of her waving her clipboard like a sword. Someone had even edited my calm line: "No, Karen, you humiliated yourself." I just locked the gate onto a backdrop of slow-motion fireworks. I should have felt triumphant, but I didn't. Not entirely. Sure, the internet was laughing at her, but I knew humiliation didn't dissolve people like Karen. It hardened them. Somewhere in that pink blazer of hers, she was already scheming. The first shot of her counterattack came quicker than expected. The very next morning, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a cease and desist letter full of pompous legal jargon, accusing me of unlawful detention of community members, reckless endangerment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The document demanded a public apology, immediate payment of damages, and a promise never to obstruct HOA events again. I laughed out loud, then slid the papers into a folder labeled evidence. Not an hour later, my phone buzzed again. A local TV station aired an interview with Karen. She sat in a studio looking somber, her pink blazer traded for a navy dress that screamed reasonable professional. With crocodile tears welling at the corners of her eyes, she described how I had entrapped innocent families and traumatized children. She claimed people had fainted from heat, that I'd endangered lives by refusing to unlock the gate. Watching it, I almost spit out my coffee. She had conveniently omitted the facts. The sheriff had been present, people had left unharmed, and the only trauma anyone suffered was the realization they'd been lied to. But the kicker, while she spun her narrative, the station cut to footage of the sheriff's press conference, where he calmly stated, "This was trespassing, plain and simple. The land is private." The HOA had no authority to host an event there. Karen's attempt to rewrite the story was crumbling before it even left the station's cameras. Still, I didn't underestimate her. For every public loss, Karen always had another angle. That evening, my attorney Notorious, a sharp-witted woman with a reputation for dismantling overzealous developers, called me. "I saw the broadcast," she said, her voice brisk. "She's digging her grave deeper. Don't engage. Document everything. We're building a wall of evidence here, and she's supplying the bricks herself." I exhaled, grateful for Lena's steadiness. "She sent me a cease and desist this morning," good Lena replied. "Keep it. That'll look fantastic when we counter for harassment and defamation. Trust me, you're standing on bedrock. She's thrashing on quicksand." Despite Lena's confidence, the next few days were a grind. HOA board members began sending out panicked emails. Some leaked to the press, blaming Karen for misusing HOA funds. Rumors swirled that she had paid for all 10 buses, catering deposits, and even promotional flyers out of community money without approval. I received anonymous messages from residents apologizing for trespassing, admitting they'd been misled. One even included screenshots of Karen's group chat where she boasted about teaching the rancher a lesson. The scandal snowballed. Local news anchors chuckled openly while reporting on Bus Karen. Late-night radio hosts joked about holding HOA meetings inside cattle pens, and one editorial in the county paper bluntly declared, "This is what happens when power meets property lines." Still, Karen fought on. She began staging little press events outside the HOA clubhouse, speaking with reporters about uncooperative neighbors. She printed glossy pamphlets portraying herself as a community champion standing up against selfish land barons. But the tide had turned. Instead of rallying her people, she was bleeding their trust. One afternoon, a former HOA board member showed up at my gate. He held out a USB drive in a trembling hand. "I can't stand by her anymore," he muttered. "You'll want to see these." Later that night, I plugged it in. My stomach knotted as I read through dozens of emails and documents. Karen had been scheming for months, not just about my property, but about others too. She had drawn up plans to annex several lots, inflate dues, and even funnel HOA funds into a personal account labeled Community Growth Initiative. The evidence was damning. I forwarded it all to Lena, who nearly cackled over the phone. "This is it," she said. "She's finished. You hold on to this, and if she so much as breathes in your direction, we file a lawsuit she can't crawl out from under." The final blow came not from me, but from within her own camp. A week later, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. Word spread fast, and though I wasn't invited, the whole county heard what happened. Karen was stripped of her presidency. The board voted unanimously to open an investigation into misused funds. By the end of the week, her house, once the biggest in the subdivision, was quietly listed for sale. I stood on my porch the night I heard the news, the cool air wrapping around me like a blanket. My goats grazed peacefully, oblivious to the storm that had raged and broken. The steel gate glinted in the moonlight, silent, steady, unyielding, just like it had been when Karen tried to breach it. But even in her downfall, I couldn't shake the feeling she'd try again. Maybe through lawsuits, maybe through intimidation, maybe through sheer stubbornness. People like Karen didn't fade quietly. I poured myself another drink, sat back in the porch chair, and looked across the pasture. The land was scarred, trampled grass, discarded trash ruts from bus tires, but it was still mine. Mine to protect, mine to defend. and I promised myself that if Karen or anyone like her tried to cross that line again, I'd be ready. Because the lesson of that day wasn't just about locking a gate. It was about showing that sometimes the simplest act of defiance, closing a door, standing your ground, refusing to bow, was enough to topple even the loudest tyrant. Karen had tried to turn my land into her stage. She hadn't realized I'd already written the script. And this act, it was only the beginning. The morning after Karen was stripped of her HOA presidency, I woke to an unusual quiet. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't buzzing with HOA letters, emails, or Karen's shrill voicemail threats. The only sound was the low murmur of my goats, bleating as the sun crept over the hills, throwing long golden light across the pasture. I wanted to believe it was over, that the nightmare had finally collapsed under its own absurdity, but in my gut I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. She was the type who would burn her own house down if it meant singeing her enemies in the process. By noon, the next wave arrived, this time not with buses, but with paperwork. A courier in a suit showed up at my gate carrying a thick stack of documents in a leather case. He introduced himself with a thin smile, sliding the packet under the bars like a smuggler passing contraband. "Miss Holloway's legal representatives," he said before retreating into his black SUV without another word. Inside the packet was a sprawling list of demands, restitution for psychological damages, reimbursement for event expenses, and even a claim for lost community trust. The document was 20 pages of bloated nonsense that boiled down to one thing: Karen was suing me. I sat on the porch with the papers spread out on my lap, shaking my head. She had lost her title, her standing, even her house, and yet she still found a way to claw at me. It was almost impressive in a grotesque way. I called Lena. "Don't even break a sweat," she said after skimming the scanned pages I sent. "This is desperation on letterhead. Half of this isn't even legally coherent. But here's the good news. Every move she makes now is costing her money she doesn't have. She's digging her own grave with gold-plated shovels." Still, the lawsuit lit a fire under me. I wasn't content to just defend myself anymore. I wanted to put this whole saga to rest once and for all. So I doubled down. I compiled every shred of evidence: emails, leaked documents, the USB drive from the ex-board member, the viral footage, even the sheriff's statement. I organized them into binders thick enough to use as doorstops. Meanwhile, the internet wasn't letting Karen breathe. Hashtags like #BusKaren and #LockedGate were trending again, with people across the country weighing in. Memes of her pink blazer popped up everywhere, paired with captions like, "When you order a park on Wish," or "HOA Hostages of America." But Karen, in her delusion, tried to spin it. She started appearing on fringe podcasts, claiming she was the victim of a land baron conspiracy, and that I had orchestrated the entire fiasco with actors posing as neighbors. The wildness of it made her look unhinged, but I knew better than to underestimate how far she'd go. The real escalation came a week later. I was mending a section of fence near the orchard when I spotted a drone buzzing overhead, its camera eye fixed squarely on my property. It wasn't one of mine. I grabbed my binoculars and tracked its flight path as it zipped back toward the subdivision across the road. My stomach turned cold. Karen had moved from legal warfare to surveillance. That night, I reviewed the footage from my security cameras. The drone had hovered near my barn, circled the gate, even dipped low over the goats as if cataloging every inch of my land. I saved the footage and sent it to Lena. "She's trying to gather evidence," Lena said, irritation crackling in her voice. "Probably to claim misuse of land or safety violations. Ignore the intimidation, document it, we'll turn it against her." But ignoring it was easier said than done. The next day, 2 men in polo shirts parked a van just outside my property line. They set up a tripod with a long-range camera aiming it squarely at my house. When I walked down the drive and waved, they scrambled, packed up, and drove off in a spray of gravel. It wasn't just annoying, it was invasive. My own land, once a sanctuary, felt like a stage under constant surveillance. Yet even as the harassment-mounted allies started coming out of the woodwork, the zoning officer, Tom, stopped by with a look of weary solidarity. "She's filing every complaint she can," he admitted, "but none of it sticks. She had us reviewing goat permits last week." "Goat permits?" He shook his head. "But the board's crumbling. Nobody's backing her anymore." A few days later, I received a letter from dozens of HOA families, signed apologies for trespassing, acknowledgments that Karen had misled them, and even offers to testify on my behalf if things went to court. Reading it at my kitchen table, I felt something shift. The tide wasn't just against her, it was turning in my favor. The final straw came from within her own circle. Late one evening, as rain pattered on the tin roof of my barn, I heard a knock at the door. Standing there soaked and shivering was Frank, the same ex-board member who had handed me the USB drive. His eyes darted nervously as he clutched another envelope. "She's planning something worse," he whispered. "She wants to stage another event, this time to reclaim her honor." I couldn't stay quiet. "You need to see this." Inside the envelope were printouts of emails Karen discussing sabotage. She was talking about cutting my fences, trespassing at night, even staging a confrontation to spin herself as the victim. I read the words with a tight jaw, my pulse steady but hot. This wasn't just obsession anymore. It was desperation. Dangerous desperation. The next morning, I took the evidence straight to Lena and then to Sheriff Patterson. The sheriff studied the papers, his jaw set hard. "She's dancing on the line of criminal charges," he said. "We'll increase patrols near your property. You stay sharp but don't engage. Let her hang herself." And so that's what I did. I kept the lights on. I walked the perimeter every evening with my goats trailing behind like loyal sentinels. I tightened my security system, installed new cameras, and logged every drone, every van, every envelope. Because I knew Karen wasn't finished. She was winding herself up for one final reckless move. And when it came, I would be ready. As I sat on my porch that night, the pasture glowing under bright security lights, I thought about how far this had gone. 10 buses, a locked gate, viral memes, legal harassment, drones, and now sabotage plots. What had started as a petty power grab had spiraled into a full-blown war of obsession, but wars end, and this one was approaching its final act. The strange quiet that lingered over my land in the weeks after Frank's late-night visit felt less like peace and more like the eye of a storm. I knew Karen well enough by now. Silence wasn't surrender. It was plotting. Sure enough, the first sign came on a gray Tuesday morning. I was sipping coffee on the porch when a white envelope marked certified mail was slipped under my gate. Inside was an official-looking letter from a prestigious law firm out of the city. It was polished, embossed with golden lettering, and it reeked of money Karen didn't have. The letter made a good-faith offer to purchase my land at nearly 3 times its market value. On paper, it was tempting, but I knew better. This wasn't a gift. It was Karen trying a new angle. If she couldn't annex my land by force, she'd try to buy it out from under me, probably with some backroom financing from sympathetic investors. I didn't hesitate. I tore the letter in half, tossed it into the wood stove, and watched it curl into black ash. But the stunt confirmed what Frank had warned. Karen was moving into her final, most desperate phase. The county zoning officer, Tom, stopped by a few days later, hat in hand, his face lined with exhaustion. "She's been pitching investors," he admitted, "telling them she can deliver your pasture as the centerpiece of a mixed-use development. Shops, trails, playgrounds, the works. They're sniffing around, but without your deed, she has nothing." He spat into the dirt, his disgust plain. "She's like a gambler bluffing with an empty hand." Inside, I was furious. The audacity of it all, Karen trying to sell my land as if it were hers to bargain away. But on the surface, I stayed calm. That was the one thing she couldn't stand, my refusal to lose composure. By then, the saga had taken on a life of its own online. A popular podcast ran a 3-part series on the bus Karen incident, painting me as a reluctant folk hero and Karen as the absurd villain. Strangers mailed me goat figurines, t-shirts printed with the phrase, "I just locked the gate," and even novelty padlocks shaped like bus wheels. The sheriff's question, "Why are you and all these people on his land?" had become a viral audio clip remixed into songs. The more Karen pushed, the more the world laughed at her. But obsession isn't rational. One rainy evening, I heard another knock at my door. Frank again, soaked through his hands, trembling as he passed me a small thumb drive sealed in a plastic bag. "You need to see this," he said, eyes darting nervously toward the road. When I plugged it into my laptop, I nearly choked on disbelief. The emails were explicit. Karen wasn't just plotting lawsuits anymore, she was talking sabotage. She had instructed a handful of die-hard loyalists to make life unbearable for me, cutting fences, scaring livestock, even trespassing at night, to stage confrontations she could twist into harassment. It was madness, and it was dangerous. I called Lena immediately. She read through the documents in silence, then said, her tone sharp and cold, "This is gold. With this, we can file for an injunction that'll keep her 1,000 feet away from your property. And if she steps out of line again, she'll be in cuffs before she can shout into a megaphone." The next morning, I carried the thumb drive straight to Sheriff Patterson. He reviewed the files, his jaw tightening with every page. "She's walking herself straight into criminal charges," he said flatly. "We'll file this with the county judge. In the meantime, I'll keep patrol cars running near your road." True to his word, by Friday, Lena called with news the judge had granted a restraining order. Karen could no longer legally step foot within 1,000 feet of my land. I printed the document, laminated it, and hung a copy right by the gate. For once, the law stood tall and visible like armor. But if I'd learned anything, it was that Karen didn't obey boundaries. Not fences, not gates, not even the law. That very night, my cameras caught two figures creeping along the ditch outside my fence, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the dark. They never crossed the line, but they lingered long enough to send a message. I sent the footage to the sheriff, who dispatched a patrol car. By the time it arrived, the figures were gone. Ghosts in the night. The escalation didn't rattle me as much as it used to. If anything, it hardened my resolve. I doubled my cameras, installed motion-triggered floodlights, and kept a spotlight trained on the steel gate like it was the front line of a fortress. My goats, bless them, became part of the theater, ambling along the fence line at dusk, their bells jingling like watchmen patrolling their post. Meanwhile, Karen's life was unraveling in public. Emails leaked to the press showed she had used HOA funds to rent the 10 buses, pay for catering, and even retain that expensive law firm, all without board approval. The HOA community, furious at being duped and billed for her ego trip, turned on her. Local news anchors openly mocked her. Commentators nicknamed her Bus Karen and the Pink General. Even her allies abandoned ship. Board members who had once stood proudly beside her began leaking more documents to reporters and apologizing to neighbors. One HOA family even sent me a handwritten note apologizing for trespassing and thanking me for holding the line when no one else dared. It was surreal. My quiet ranch, once a target, had become a symbol. Yet Karen's obsession didn't stop. She began appearing on fringe online forums, spinning elaborate conspiracies about me being part of a shadow cabal of landowners. She claimed the sheriff was biased, the news manipulated the goats, weaponized as psychological intimidation. Her words grew wilder, her credibility thinner, but the venom never dulled. One Saturday morning, a black sedan rolled slowly up the county road, stopping just beyond my gate. Through the tinted glass, I caught a glimpse of Karen in the passenger seat, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She didn't get out. She didn't shout. She just sat there staring at my land like a queen stripped of her throne, peering at the kingdom she'd never have. I recorded it, of course, but part of me almost pitied her. Almost. That pity evaporated when a week later, a local news report aired that Karen had secretly mortgaged her house to pay legal fees and lost it when she couldn't keep up. She had sold it off quietly, slinking away from the subdivision she once ruled like a fiefdom. But even in ruin, she found ways to claw back. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox. "Your goats won't save you. We're still watching." I handed them all to the sheriff, who logged them as evidence of harassment. At this point, though, it wasn't fear I felt. It was a grim anticipation. Every move she made was more desperate, more erratic, and desperation always ends the same way, with collapse. Standing on my porch one crisp evening, I watched the sun sink behind the hills, the steel gate glowing orange in the last light. My goats grazed peacefully, bells chiming softly, oblivious to the storm of human drama. I thought back to the day those 10 buses rolled up to the clang of the gate, locking shut to Karen's shrill cries through her megaphone. It all felt distant now, like the opening act of a long play. But I could sense the finale approaching. Because Karen wasn't just beaten, she was unraveling. And when people like her unravel, they don't do it quietly. No, I knew the last act was coming. And I was ready. The dawn of what would become the final chapter in the saga broke with an unusual stillness. The air was crisp, the sky painted with pale streaks of violet and gold. My goats moved lazily through the dew-soaked grass, their bells chiming softly like a morning hymn. The steel gate stood gleaming in the first light, not just a barrier anymore, but a symbol, a sentinel that had weathered every storm Karen had thrown my way. By then, weeks had passed since the injunction. Karen's presence had all but vanished from the county roads and HOA boardrooms. She had been ousted from power, her house sold under financial strain, her reputation shredded by viral memes and leaked emails. To most people, the story was over. A lesson in overreach, a cautionary tale about entitlement gone wild. But I couldn't shake the instinct that she had one last card to play. People like Karen didn't just disappear. They reinvented themselves, clawing for one final gasp of relevance. I was right. That morning, a county vehicle pulled up to my gate. It was Tom, the zoning officer, wearing his usual wide-brimmed hat and a tired but genuine smile. He handed me a thick envelope, the county seal stamped on the front. "It's done," he said simply. Inside were official documents, signed, sealed, permanent. The county had formally recognized my property as non-HOA in perpetuity. It was ironclad, no petition, no vote, no committee could ever attempt to claim jurisdiction over my land again without my explicit consent. Holding those papers, I felt something close to dizzy relief. Months of harassment standoffs and courtroom maneuvers had boiled down to this, a simple truth finally etched into law. But as I savored that victory, Karen's final unraveling was playing out elsewhere. Local news ran footage of her leaving the courthouse with her attorney head down, refusing to answer questions about fraud, misuse of funds, and harassment. The anchors' voices were tinged with disbelief, even ridicule. This was the same woman who once strutted in neon blazers, barking orders through a megaphone. Now she was a diminished figure, clutching a fraying clipboard like a shield against the cameras. Neighbors told me she'd moved into a rental 2 towns over. Others whispered she'd fled the state. Either way, her reign was over. And yet what struck me most wasn't the schadenfreude, it was the emptiness. For months, Karen's chaos had filled my days: fences to repair, drones to track, lawyers to call, goats to protect. Now with her gone, the silence felt heavier than I expected. But silence can also heal. A week later, I received a handwritten letter from a family who'd once boarded one of Karen's buses. They apologized for trespassing, thanked me for standing firm, and invited me to a community meeting. At first, I hesitated. The last thing I wanted was to sit in a room full of HOA members. But something in their words rang sincere. Curiosity nudged me, and I decided to attend. That evening, I drove across the road for the first time in months. The subdivision clubhouse was small, its folding chairs filled with maybe 30 people. Their faces carried a mix of shame and hope. One by one, they stood to apologize. For believing Karen's lies, for following her onto my land, for not questioning her authority sooner. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rant or gloat. I simply said, all I ever wanted was to live peacefully on my land. I don't hold grudges against families. My fight was with her abuse of power, not with you. We talked for an hour about boundaries, respect, and communication. When I left, several shook my hand and one child shyly asked if they could meet my goats someday. That simple request hit me harder than all the legal victories combined. It meant the wall between us was starting to crumble. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. Slowly, the community mended. The HOA issued a public statement admitting its errors and promising reforms. The county revised zoning bylaws to explicitly protect independent properties like mine. And little by little, neighbors began waving again when they drove past, no longer seeing me as the enemy but as the man who stood his ground. My land, once scarred by bus tires and trampled grass, began to heal too. I reseeded the pasture, repaired the fences, and scrubbed the barn until the smell of hay and cedar replaced the stench of diesel exhaust. My goats thrived, blissfully unaware they had become internet celebrities. Tourists occasionally drove by to snap photos of the infamous gate, but mostly life returned to the rhythm it had always known. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost story. At neighborhood barbecues, people joked, "Don't go full bus Karen," whenever someone got too pushy. Teenagers laughed about the memes. Some said she was starting over far away. Others whispered she was still lurking, nursing her grudge. But none of it mattered. She had no power here anymore. One crisp autumn evening, I unlocked the gate and invited a small group of HOA children onto my land to feed the goats. Their laughter echoed across the pasture, replacing the angry shouts I once endured. Watching them hold out handfuls of grain while the goats nuzzled eagerly, I realized something: this conflict hadn't just protected my land, it had reshaped the community. Boundaries had been redrawn, respect relearned. The steel gate, once a weapon, was now just a gate again, keeping goats in, keeping the road out. And as I stood there in the fading light, hand resting on the cool metal, I felt not just relief but gratitude. Because Karen's obsession, absurd as it was, had forged something stronger in me: patience, resilience, and the certainty that standing your ground calmly, firmly, without flinching can change everything. That night, under a sky full of stars, I finally allowed myself to breathe easy. The buses were gone. The sheriff had left his final report. The county had sealed the boundaries. The saga was over. And for the first time in months, I was free again to live, to breathe, to watch the goats graze in peace, no bus ever daring to invade this land again. If there's one thing this bizarre chapter taught me, it's that boundaries matter. Not just fences and gates, but the invisible lines we draw around our lives, our dignity, and our peace of mind. People like Karen exist everywhere. People who believe rules don't apply to them, who disguise entitlement as leadership, who push until you're forced to push back. But here's the truth: standing firm doesn't require rage or chaos. Sometimes it's as simple as saying no, locking the gate, and letting the truth do its work. My story went viral, yes, but beyond the memes and headlines, it's a reminder that power without respect collapses on itself. and that even one person armed with patience and resolve can draw a line the whole world ends up noticing. So wherever you are watching this, remember your boundaries are worth defending, your peace is worth protecting. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Now I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from and whether you've faced a Karen in your life. And if you enjoyed this saga, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because if this tale taught us anything, it's that when the gate closes, the real drama begins.